Good, good morning, everyone. Salamat pagi, buenos días, buongiorno, salsan hao. To everyone who is online, please stay in. We will start in 2 minutes. Now it's 10:03. So we just hold on for a minute, and then I will welcome our speakers. Today we have a very exciting talk, and I'm looking forward because I have just 2 pre-post questions. And I think after our conversation a week ago on the First Nation art, it has struck me that term because it was the first time that it came to me. So I did a little bit of research, and also that term is used in Canada to address a group of people, the indigenous over there too, as well, or Indians, what we call in Peru as well. You know, the local people, the Indians. Okay, so good morning, salamat pagi, buenos días, buongiorno, everyone. Welcome to this 6th edition of Gallery Weekend Kuala Lumpur 2021, Luminary 2, talk series celebrating culture in Kuala Lumpur and now virtually. Today's talk title is Creators, Curating and Collecting Way of Seeing. We are glad to have you here, because Gallery Weekend Kuala Lumpur represent a multidisciplinary collaboration fostering appreciation of the art in all areas and categories. This Luminary Talk program has been an anchor feature where we have the opportunity to engage with a variety of practicing artists, curators, galleries, and experts with wider interests, making an impact in the community. Gallery Weekend Kuala Lumpur is a unique Malaysian pavilion. This platform celebrates local and global art in Kuala Lumpur. My name is Ernesto Pujazon, artist and academic, and I will be your host and moderator. Let me proceed further, and I would like to make some announcement. Kindly turn off your mute your microphone during the speaker presentation to avoid any distraction, and please keep your video on. Feel free to write your question in the Q&A chat box discussion, and I will be delighted to read it to our distinguished panelists. And the event of the internet dropping on my side or any panelist, I will just keep it on, and then please try to reconnect. We will do so. Now allow me to introduce today's speakers. Brenda Elkroff is from my humble apologies for the pronunciation, Gurindji Malgin Mudburra people from Victoria River region of the Northern Territory of Australia. She's an Anglo-Australian, German, Irish, and Chinese heritage. Brenda multidisciplinary practice-led research encompasses critical performative, indigenous autoethnographic representation and identity, indigenous storying and creative narrative, installation, multimedia, multi-platform work. She works on personal and public archive, memory, and memorialization. Brenda was awarded her Doctor of Philosophy from University of New South Wales 2021, Australia. She's an Associate Professor of Indigenous Art and Art History, Curatorship, Center for Art History and Art Theory, Australian National University, School of Art and Design, College of Art and Social Science. Her areas of expertise is visual art, craft, lens-based practice, which is the first time coming across with this term, performance and installation art, performing art, and creative writing. Her research interest is Australian First Nation, contemporary visual art, and culture. The second speaker is Ms. Kelly Gellatly, independent cultural advisor, museum director, curator, writer, and art advocate, living and working on the land of the Wurundjeri Bunurong people, South Central Victoria, around the present location of Melbourne. Kelly is a senior executive with over 25 years art leadership, curatorial, and collection development experience in national, state, and university-based art museum with long-standing contribution to the enrichment and education of the diverse community through art. She has a deep working knowledge of the Australian culture sector, a strong professional and collegiate network within Australia and internationally, and the ability to aggregate and lead change. She has extensive experience in the design, oversight, and delivery of major museum infrastructure projects, a strong fundraising history, including securing corporate sponsorship and major philanthropic grants, and a history of successful international and Australia partnership. Kelly is passionate about facilitating and encouraging the broadest possible access to the art, particularly contemporary practice, and supporting the leadership potential of women in the arts. I hope I got the names and the titles correct. My humble apologies if I have any mispronunciation. It's quite hard. Thank you to you both for participating in today's event. So let me talk about the dynamic of the presentation, and it's as follows. Each panelist will have around 35 minutes to do a presentation based on your own theme. And I will address 2 pre-posed questions to each panelist to share their views. And you will have 3 to 5 minutes to answer the question. And that will roll the ball for the Q&A question from the floor. So please let me invite and welcome Dr. Croft to speak to us on today's presentation. Dr. Croft, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ernesto. And that was a very more than capable attempt at pronouncing my long-winded background. Before I start, I wish to pay my respects to the traditional First Nations custodians on whose lands I am privileged to live and work, the Nyambri and Ngunnawal peoples of the area known as Canberra in the Australian Capital Territory in this country. And as Ernesto said in his introduction, my patrilineal heritage is from the Gurindji Malyan Wutwara peoples of the Northern Territory, a long way from where I live and work, but always in my heart and the foundation pretty much of what I do as a multidisciplinary creative practitioner. I'm aware that I've got 35 minutes, so I might lead straight into the PowerPoint presentation. But before I do that, I'd like to say what a privilege it is to be part of this panel today. Thank you to the organisers for inviting me to participate. And it's also a great joy to be here with my colleague and friend, Kelly Gellatly, who I haven't seen face-to-face for quite some time, but it's very nice to be here in cyberspace with you. So Ernesto, is it okay if I go straight to share screen? Yep. Right,
yes, please. No. The floor is yours.
And now I've lost my PowerPoint. Where did it go? We love this, don't we? Let me just find where it's gone. I'm so sorry about this. I'll look that up while I'm talking to you. I seem to have turned it off. Nope, that's not it. Apologies, I'll just keep talking. I'm based in Canberra at the Australian National University, where I work as an educator for the Centre of Art History and Art Theory. And here is my PowerPoint opening up. So we'll go to from the beginning. Can I just ask that everybody is able to see this?
No, at the moment.
What is happening? Pardon me. Share screen. What's going on? Ah, there it is. Sorry. Now, can we see that?
Yes.
Okay, let's just go from the beginning. Is it going to let me go from the beginning? Doesn't look like it.
I think there is a little icon at the bottom of that big picture on the right-hand side. And then if you click that, it will go to the
it worked when we just did the, it's just not letting me go from the...
Do you need Kenny to help you out?
Well, I don't know how Kenny can because it was working previously when we just did the run through. I don't know why this is not going from the beginning. Clicking on it. Nope.
You can try again.
So sorry about this.
It's okay.
Now it's choosing not to work.
Just now my internet also dropped a few times and the image was frozen while I'm speaking to Kenny.
And this is the joys of being across time and space, isn't it? I'll go out of it and I'll try and come back in. See if that works.
But the sound in the
picture
picture
now
is
I've got it.
clear.
So
yes, it's very clear.
Pardon?
Your sound and picture is very clear. Excellent.
So let's have
Kelly as
another.
well.
How is that? We see that? Yes, here we go. Thank you, everybody, for your patience.
Excellent.
Okay, so also, Kenny, Ernesto, I'll ask you to give me a reminder when I'm close to my 35 minutes.
Okay, you have 11 o'clock flat?
I'm on 113, so okay. What I'm going to talk about today is what I actually dealt with in my practice-led doctoral research project. I've worked as an artist and a curator and a creative for 3.5 decades now. My practice is informed by my Australian First Nations heritage as a First Nations woman in this country, Gorinji Malian Mukura woman, and my my practice-led doctoral research project involved working very closely with my patrilineal community in the Northern Territory, but not just on our traditional homelands, but also with community members who, like many in my family, had been displaced over decades of government official policies of removal of people of mixed race under the assimilationist policies of the time. And that most directly included my father and my grandmother, who were both born on their traditional lands in the Northern Territory in the early part of the 20th century. My father was born in the mid-1920s, and in 1927 they were both removed from their country and taken to a series of government-run institutions. The title of my presentation today, Curator, Stone Axe Head to Karatak, Container or Cup, is looking at a 10-year project of engagement with family and community members, and particularly walking a track on that country, which I'll get straight into in showing in the PowerPoint presentation. The stone axe that you see in the image in front of you is an object that has been very much a guide for me in my research project for this period that I worked with my family and community. And I must say, it hasn't just simply been part of the past decade, it's been a lifelong project. And it will continue for as long as I live in that reclamation and reimagining of stories and histories of my people. I like to start with a bit of tongue-in-cheek, an image from a 1912 publication by a white Australian man who, the title of the book is self-evident there, Australian Natives Standpoint. So I like to think that I'm flipping that a little bit on its head in a reclamation of what a native person is in this country. Back then, in the early part of the 20th century, Australian native denoted people who were born on the continent of Australia. So British heritage mainly, but were considered themselves native born to the country. This is the long title of my thesis that accompanied my PhD. My PhD comprised a collaborative exhibition working with family members and community members on an exhibition that was opened in 2017 and continues to tour nationally and will until the end of next year. But it also comprised an extensive thesis over 100,000 words, which discussed the journey on which I had taken for the past 10 years, but also earlier recollections of family histories were incorporated into that. My background is not unusual for people of mixed race in this country. My father was Aboriginal, my mother Anglo-Australian, German-Irish background. My dad also had Chinese-Irish heritage. And I was the eldest of 3 children. They met in the late 1950s working on a huge infrastructure project in Australia. married in the early 1960s. I was born in 1964. So this kind of image that you see is one that's familiar to lots of people in Australia. The only thing that slightly stands out is the fact that my dad's Aboriginal. So that was the unusual element of it. And we moved a lot in my early childhood following my father's work. He worked as a surveyor. He was likely the first Aboriginal person to go to university in Australia, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But he had been removed from his traditional country as an infant with my grandmother and taken up to a place called Carlin Compound in Darwin. And then he was taken from her care when he was about 5 years old. And we weren't reunited with her until shortly before she died in 1974. My father was almost 50 by that stage. And so he spent most of his adult life away from her and the rest of his family. These images on this page relate to the journey home that he took in 1989 out to community at Wave Hill in the Northern Territory in the Victoria River region, seeking reconnection with family and community out there. We were lucky enough, as I said, to be reunited with my grandmother in 1974, and my father had been put back in touch with her in the late 1960s. But this journey for him was incredibly important. You can see here he's with an elder from the community, Lizzie Yillawar, and luckily for me, he also conducted a series of oral history interviews with community members when he went out there, which I've been able to draw on in my own work. I first went out to our patrilineal country in 1991 with family members, Auntie Daisy Ruddick, who's on the top right there and on the left. I was fortunate to go back out with her, and Auntie Daisy was about 11 years older than my father and had remembered him as an infant at the children's home in Darwin. She was one of the older people there, and so it was really instrumental for me going with her back out to community, and she was able to reconnect me with people there as well. The man at the top left, Uncle Mick, Poppy Mick Rangiari, was one of the senior elders in the community who really took me under his wing. 1996, my father had died, and my brother Tim and I took his ashes home to be interred in country, to take him back to his country. And these images from that journey home in 1996. The bottom right image is a series of family members, all women, strong Gorinji women, who I'm very honoured to be part of their family. And I always say that I stand on the shoulders of the people who came before me and created the pathway on which I have walked. Family is absolutely the foundation of what I do. Relational responsibility in my research is key. I have obligations to not just myself and what I manage to achieve. It's not simply for my own benefit. It's also for people in my family, and I have a responsibility to them in how I represent the information that they've shared with me on my journey. And that's the core of what I do, is that kind of obligation and responsibility as a First Nations person. You will find that amongst Indigenous peoples across the globe, the relationality of our responsibilities to the rest of our community is absolutely key. And so there is always that tension as well, I think, in that while we might be shaping the research that we present, it is not ours alone to claim. So there's always that responsibility for how you represent your own community. At the same time, I can only speak for myself, and I don't lay claim to be the spokesperson for Gorinji, Malyan, Muttra peoples. I have accessed public archives for many years now, I'd say decades, And I've also drawn on personal family archives as well. And what we're looking at here is the Timber Creek Police Station Letters Book from 1926 to 28, which I accessed in the National Archives of the Northern Territory Archives Service back in 2014. And in this publication, this was the earliest record that I found of my father, 1927, 1st of July. And I'll just read out the text because you mightn't be able to see it well. I'll start from here. The following half-castes were sent to Darwin half-caste home. Joe Quadroon and his half-caste mother named Bessie. The redacted names there had to be redacted at the direction of the present day Northern Territory Department of Police, Fire and Emergency Services, who have responsibility for these public archives. But I remember well sitting there in the access room at the archives in the Territory and reading what was on this page, and my response was really visceral. It wasn't simply a validation of the existence of my father and grandmother, because for many First Nations peoples in Australia, we don't have these records. I'm fortunate in that there is a paper trail that I have been able to trace, but to see my father's name and my grandmother's name here on the page was like a sucker punch, basically, a punch to the stomach. And my physical reaction was I burst into tears, and the wonderful people at the archives are always cognizant when people such as myself are coming in and looking at these archives, and they were so supportive and kind, and I'll never forget that. But it underscores for me how much the archives are a place of violence for First Nations peoples. Ironically, these are one of the places where we can find evidence of our existence, but on the other hand, they are also places of pain. And I'm not the only First Nations researcher to have said that. I draw on people such as Dr. Natalie Harkin, who's a colleague who has written on researching the archives in relation to her grandmother and her matrilineal history in South Australia, and many other First Nations researchers. Other archives I've accessed have been the South Australian Museum archives, and I was led to those by one day just typing my grandmother's name, Bessie Croft, into Google search, and a link came up to a particular section in the South Australian Museum archives, the Norman Tyndale archives, which are an extensive archives, national archives containing material on First Nations peoples from right around the country, and a subsection of that archive, the Cecil James Hackett archive, brought up my grandmother's name, and this was from 1934, and there was also a note on the link that there were photographs of my grandmother. Her name was there. I was so excited because I had only images of her, a very small number of images of her from our meeting in 1974 when I was 10, and so I thought, oh, I'll get to see her as a young woman. The people who worked at the South Australian Museum archive were also extremely generous and kind, and they advised me that these records were within the medical research capacity of the South Australian Museum archives, which I didn't realise what that meant until I received the images and discovered that my grandmother had been the subject of a white researcher from 1934 who was studying medicine at the Adelaide University and had been given permission to study First Nations peoples through the Northern Territory for his own doctoral research. So the irony here was decades later, I was retracing his steps, and the bittersweet thing of the fact that he bothered to write my grandmother's name down, I'm eternally thankful for, but the fact that he used her as a subject for his own research was infuriating. I'll just read out this text here. I'm sure people are reading it, but you can imagine what it's like seeing your grandmother debased in such a way. Dr. Cecil Cook who was the protector of Aborigines, kindly placed the inmates of the half-caste institution at Darwin at my disposal. Under the present policy for the treatment of the half-caste problem, and that's what people such as my father were considered a problem, the children are taken from their mothers in the native camps when about 3 to 5 years of age. Cases 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12 who showed leg deformity and scars were grouped together. The last two cases, 11 and 12, were not inmates of the half-caste institution. Cases: female half-castes from Darwin, complete skin exposure. Case 12, aged circa 30, Chinese native from Victoria River. Personal history: had extensive sores, later pains in legs, and developed boomerang legs, which is basically a bone deficiency associated with extreme poverty. It's a bit like rickets. When about 4 or 5 years of age, has had 2 children, both dead. Now, my father was one of those children that's considered both dead. Boomerang legs, marked right more so than left. Maximum curve is below centre of leg, etc., etc. The images were sections of my grandmother, basically. I still didn't get to see what she actually looked like. He also wrote descriptions of her genitalia, and I have no idea whether he took photographs of that as well. This is not an unusual case. It's just the fact that I've been able to source this information. Let's jump ahead now to my father, having been removed from my grandmother's care, placed in another children's home in Central Australia. Here's the altar boy on the left-hand side here. This photograph's from about 1938, 1940, shortly before he was sent to boarding school in another state in the in Australia, in Queensland. That was an unusual journey for a child of mixed race, First Nations, Anglo, etc. Back then, back in the 1930s and 40s. Such children were considered only fit for either domestic service, if they were young women, unpaid, or working in the pastoral industry as unpaid stockmen. My father's journey was predicated by or supported by an unusual man of great standing and a strong advocate of social justice, an Anglican priest, Father Percy Smith, who ensured that my father was sent to a very good boarding school where he, at the end of his 4 years there, had become school captain and sports captain, and he won a Commonwealth bursary at the time, which took him to Queensland University. So this was 1944, that he went to Queensland University. Highly unusual in the day, so unusual that it made national media. This series of works, Blood Type, is a series of photographic self-portraits, but they're also a call and response to my father and my grandmother. And these were created as a body of work as part of my PhD in 2016. Full Blood is a bit of a play on words relating to going back home out to Wave Hill, and one of my cousins from Wave Hill community taking me around and introducing me to non-Indigenous people on the community and explaining to them that I was her full blood cousin, and their confused looks because they couldn't see how I had a connection with my cousin. So I like to play with that. And of course, we're all full of blood. And the image on the right is Octoroon, which would be the descriptor afforded to me if I so chose to take it, but I reject that. I'm a First Nations person. I don't break myself down into those fractions. Now, these descriptors on the images here are taken directly from press clippings relating to my father, either going to the high school or then going on to university. And they ranged from Abo, native. Abo is a very pejorative term in Australia for Aboriginal, coloured, half-caste, half-blood, and he was also described in one clipping as a scholar, brilliant, clever. He was a ward of the state. So All of these terms and descriptors were used to categorize him and other First Nations peoples of mixed heritage. Dark blood and light blood were also descriptors that were used for a long time to describe people of colour as having dark blood, someone having light blood. The idea that if you have European blood, then there's a better chance of you being civilized. So there was all this kind of eugenicist categorization that continued well into the mid part of the 20th century. The image at the top is the only image we have of my father and grandmother when they were reunited in 1974. She was very ill by that time, and we didn't have the benefit of mobile phones where you can just take thousands and thousands of images. We had little old Kodak Instamatic camera, and my mother did take a lot of images, but unfortunately most of them were destroyed accidentally by the chemist who was developing the film. And so we had one roll of film that had this image of my father and grandmother, which has formed the basis of quite a number of works I've done over the years. My mother was a born-again Christian, she had a strong Christian faith in the later part of her life. And the crucifixes, crocheted crucifixes, were made by her in the colours of the Aboriginal flag, and she made them following my father's death and handed them out at his funeral as a way of trying to marry her spiritual beliefs with my father's cultural beliefs. And I used these in an installation that I made in honour of her in 2018. The image on the bottom right are family members from Wave Hill from the late 1960s, early 70s, people who I would also call grandmother and uncles and aunts. And this image was given to me by a cousin who walked up to me out the front of the community store one day and pulled it out of her bra. She'd been carrying it around in her bra, waiting to see me. And so these kinds of exchanges, the way that images are exchanged as forms of connection between family members are really key, really important. So it's an image that I really treasure. I've come back to this because the bottom right, we won't stay on this too much, but the bottom right, I'll just read out the last sentence. Over her lower abdomen, groin, thighs, and pudenda, the skin surface was greatly changed and thinned, pigmentation slightly increased, adhesion of anterior part of right labium major to thigh, forming a cul-de-sac opening upwards. Both labia majora showed scarring. So the fact that he felt that it was his place to use my grandmother as a specimen for his doctoral research disgusts me, but what I've tried to do is take my anger with those words and form them into what I wrote about in my thesis, and also to give back dignity to my grandmother in some way. And by doing that, I did this diptych shut mouth scream, which is a kind of call and response to her over the decades from when that first image was taken. And it was taken on the 17th of May, 1934. I've accessed his field records in the South Australian Museum archives. And the 17th of May is my birthday, but 30 years later. That year, 1934, my white grandfather had died in January of that year. So my grandmother was truly alone. He was known as the only white man who visited his children at Carlin Compound. He didn't have any say over their being removed from his care. And my grandmother also being taken out of being with him. They had worked on different cattle stations together in the Northern Territory. He was quite a bit older than her, and when he died, she was truly alone. Dr. Cecil James Hackett wrote in the notes next to her name on the 17th of May 1934 that she was Chinese native half-caste. And so as a way of honouring her, I claim all of those in my heritage. My father's gravesite at Kalkaringi, Wave Hill, is in the background. self-portrait of myself, self-portrait obviously, at Kalkaringi Cemetery. Working with family and community, I was also able to participate in other projects with our colleagues through the Karangarni Art and Culture Centre, and that was such a privilege. So I got to be involved as the documenter, taking photographs of site visits throughout vast tracts of Gurindji country for a major history project that turned into a publication, Yidjani, True Stories from Gurindji Country. And young Gurindji rangers that you can see here with elders. We travelled to massacre sites. We travelled to sites relating to different oral histories that predated first contact with white people. So this is the late 19th century. And it was really a revelation to be able to travel with many of these learned people, a lot of whom have passed away since this photograph was taken. It gave me a much better understanding of that country. I will never know the country in the same way that people who have grown up on that country and are embedded, it's embedded within them. But I, through my work, can show how I have a connection to that country and how I filter that through my own standpoint as a Gurindji Malyan Mutpara woman. I walked the Wave Hill walk-off track up in that country with family. Darwin is up here. I haven't got a map of Australia on here, but Darwin is in the Northern Territory. So here is the area that's Wave Hill and the Wave Hill walk-off route, which is a 22-kilometre track that 200 plus Aboriginal Gurindji and other associated peoples walked off a station in 1966 in a fight for equal pay, which quickly turned into a fight for land rights. And it was arguably the birth of the national Aboriginal land rights movement in Australia. I walked that track with family. Here's my cousin and I, Michael, or MP, walking a section of that track together, and I made film and audio recordings along that track, which were represented in a major installation in the exhibition Still in My Mind, Gurindji Location Experience and Visuality, the exhibition that I mentioned previously. Self-portraits on country, different parts of that country, that track over different seasons and different years. It's remote. It's about 8 to 9 hours drive southwest of Darwin. There's an airstrip at Kalkaringi. It's only a small community. A few hundred people live at Kalkaringi and the neighbouring Dargaragu community. They're 8 kilometres apart. So to get a flight there, though, you have to charter an aeroplane. Most people travel by bus or drive, depending on what you can afford to do. And it's a community that's been really impacted by the latest COVID outbreak in the Northern Territory, and also the nearby community of Binjari, which is in the news at the moment. It's had the largest outbreak of COVID at this time, and they're really concerned with that. So I'm in regular contact with family members about how they're going, because COVID impacts First Nations communities much harder than non-Indigenous peoples in Australia. Tell me how I'm going, Ernesto.
Yes, you are fine.
These images are from aspects of Gurindji country over the time that I was working on my PhD project. It's beautiful country. It's hard country. It has monsoonal rains. When the rains come, it can be cut off. The highway can be cut off. The roads to the community can be cut off. The two communities of Dargaragu and Kalkaringi can be cut off from each other by Waddy Creek flooding. People have drowned trying to cross the creek. It's there are vast skies up there, and it's country that I really miss as well. I worked with a number of the artists from Karangarni Art and Culture, and the exhibition included their their works, history paintings really, of the walk-off in 1966, but also predating that as well. Many of these artists have passed away, and so again, I pay my deep respects to being able to have spent a small amount of time with them, and the legacy of their great knowledge is represented in their artworks. Violet Wadrell Nunaku, this painting is by my aunt, who thankfully is still with us. She's one of the senior knowledge women from the community, has helped on numerous language projects, language reclamation projects, documentation projects, bush medicine projects, a woman of great knowledge and respect. Her granddaughter, my niece, is Leah, and I worked very closely with Leah throughout my PhD research project. A history painting of Gough Whitlam, then Labor Prime Minister, handing back part of the country in a symbolic gesture to Vincent Lingiari in 1975. I want to get to some installation images in a second. My granddad, who I called grandfather, who's since passed, at the what's called the killing yards, where the cattle were taken to be slaughtered and then shipped up to Darwin. Wave Hill Station was owned by a British member of the aristocracy. Lord Vestey was his name, and they had owned that for decades. Vast wealth went from that region directly to the UK, to Britain, and there was a law passed in British legislation that they didn't have to pay tax in Australia. So the wealth of that country, which was basically taken on the back of Aboriginal people, they wouldn't have had a workforce without Aboriginal people working on their stations, left the country, certainly didn't benefit my people. The Kartak, which is the tin cup that I referred to in the title here, was a handmade object made out of an old food tin that I found at the rubbish dump out at Wave Hill Station. And like the stone axe, when you picked up the stone axe and put it in your hand, it fits perfectly in the palm of your hand, almost as if it's been made for you. Holding the tin cup is likewise, it fits perfectly in the palm of your hand. And these two objects for me signify ancient wisdom and contemporary representation of what's happened on that country, both made by creators unknown. I created a series of screen prints referring to the pastoral impact on the country up there. There's thousands of discarded horseshoes and fencing wire twists all over that country, as well as objects like the tin cup. Wave Hill and Kalkaringi and Dargaragu have been seriously impacted by the imposition of the Northern Territory emergency response, the intervention that was brought into play by the federal government in 2007 and continues to this day. Prescribed communities were made prescribed areas, and these incredibly racist signs were placed outside of each of the communities, remote communities, and also Aboriginal communities in towns, which were basically stating that there were possible criminals living in each of the communities. People within the community, the army was also sent into many of these communities, probably one of the few times that the Australian Defence Force has been used against its own peoples. This sign here on the left, the way that people in the communities could actually fight back were to attack the sign. So the one on the left was driven into and graffiti was put across it. The one on the right, my nephew painted it with the colours of the Aboriginal flag and punched a hole in the centre of it. That sign is missing now. I wish we'd been able to had the foresight to sort of collect it, to put it in the National Museum collection. So all that's left are the signposts, but it was, thankfully, because I was able to take a photograph of it, it was used on the cover of a book on the intervention. Family is key. Working with family, I could do none of the work and research that I've done by myself. They have been my guides, my aunts, uncles, grandparents, community members, cousins, nieces, nephews, and also non-Indigenous colleagues I was able to work with on the project. Photographing elders such as Biddy Wave Hill and my Aunt Violet in the creek bed, the river bed of the Victoria River. Mr. Wave Hill, Malaga Yai, passed away last year. This photograph I took of him was used for the cover of the history book, which is great. Other images I've taken of senior people doing song and ceremony have been used for publications such as Songs from the Stations. My darling Aunt Nancy, who had passed away a couple of years ago, I worked closely, she was my dad's younger sister, I worked closely with her visiting sites of significance in Darwin, including the site of Carlin Compound where my dad and my grandmother were taken to in 1927. We located the gravesite of my non-Indigenous grandfather, her father, in Darwin Cemetery. She didn't know where he was buried. I was able to take her there before he passed away. The site of the boys' home in Pine Creek that my father was taken to in 1931. Channel Island, which was a leprosarium in Darwin for decades that my aunt and uncle were inmates at, and is now ironically a heritage site for people who will be able to visit that. This is the site of their old hut. All that's left of it is the roof that collapsed into the ground where my aunt Nancy and Jack lived. So visiting these sites is a way of memorialising and paying tribute to the lives of people who've been written out of Australian history. That's what I see my role is to be their advocate, to make people remember, to challenge people. The great forgetting in this country is acknowledged. The misrepresentation of Australian society continues as this kind of British outpost, whereas it is many, many different nations who are here. And of course, First Nations first and foremost. This is the site of Retta Dixon Home, which is where we stayed with my grandmother in '74. She was the laundress there. I'm just going to go through photos of family and we'll get to the images of the exhibition installation. So the exhibition is a collaboration with members of the community. There's also found objects from the old cattle stations. There are archives from lots of public archives around the country relating to the community. This is the installation of the footage that I shot and audio incorporating oral histories that date back to the 1980s. It was really important for me that members of the community came to venues that showed the exhibition and were part of the public programs to speak on their own terms, not me speaking on behalf of them. And I just loved having people together and watching them watch archival material. And so I'm a bit of a detective, I think, in that I track down a lot of this material and I can source copies of it for people from community. One of the longer term projects will be to create a digital archive that people can access from community that hopefully can also be added to, not just something that's a static archive, but as more material comes up, it can be added to this and it can be a place that people can go to so they don't have to kind of troll through all the places that I've had to. Different venues have been chosen for their relationship to community. So this is at Katherine, which is the nearest large town to Kalkaringi and Dargaragu. Darwin, because a lot of Gurindji family members ended up in Darwin because they were removed and taken away. Huge extended family around the country. The stone axe has been really key, a key touchstone literally and metaphorically and metaphysically, I guess, for me as well. I say that it found me on country. I didn't find it. It found me at a place called Bore 17 on the site visits. We pulled up to Bore 17, which is basically just a windmill and cattle yards. And I got out of the car I was driving, the troop carrier I was driving, looked down, and at my feet was this amazing stone axe. There were cattle all around us, and cattle have been there since 1883, but this stone axe was just sitting there waiting, and I showed it to my aunt, and with their permission, it's been in the exhibition and touring with that exhibition. This gives you a sense of the scale of it with my niece and her granddaughter. Another stone axe was gifted by my auntie Kathy Mills, and that's also touring in the exhibition. A recent exhibition that's on at the moment, Handmade Held Ground at the Canberra Museum and Gallery, includes multiple representations of that original stone axe, Curator, and they've been cast in lead, crystal and glass. And in a way, they're meant to represent the spirits of people from that community, including family members. They're also like a heartbeat. They are the footprints on country. They are the representations of people who were removed and never got to go back home. They are the representations of people from that country. My father and brother feature in much of what I do as guides. Both are passed away. There's a street named after both of them here in Canberra, and that's my young son with the street down the bottom. And my mother features in a lot of my work as well. And this is from an exhibition, Heart in Hand, that honoured her 80th birthday in 2018. The crucifixes that she crocheted are on the back wall there that you can see. She was a great collector and archivist. I say that's where I get my archival tendencies from, because she kept everything. And I like to share, and I like how they trigger memories for other people as well. When this exhibition was on, I enjoyed going in and sitting in the space, and I would see lots of older women bringing their grandchildren in and showing them things that they could relate to from their own younger lives. I'm coming to the end now. Oh, that image there, the young fella on the right, Ben Ennis Butler, is the son of one of my PhD supervisors, Helen Ennis. And I've known Ben since he was a young boy, and he helped me work out how to submit my PhD. So it was just really fitting that I had him there at the end. Those journeys that you take, you don't ever do them by yourselves. You have lots of help and assistance along the way. And so for me, it was really important to thank his mum for having him to help me finish my PhD journey. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Brenda, for such an interesting journey. Actually, I was wondering about if you have checked any church or parish archive for your research, because I was writing a document, a paper, an article about Newton. How do you call the alchemy practice? And through this pandemic, and the church basically is the center where most of the people, the newborns are registered, baptized, weddings, and also when someone passes on, also is registered. I was wondering if that also has been part of your research. If you can give me just a short answer so I can continue with Ms. Kelly.
Sure. There's not so much in relation to my dad, because the police letters books were the key places, because the policemen in those remote communities, they were the key record keepers. Oh. And there were church-run homes, but the archives are mainly government archives. I've got a good relationship with Father Percy Smith's family, his son, who has been really generous in giving me information, but it's been mainly government archives. And I do know the church in many other communities and countries has been really a key documenter of that. But in my dad's case, it was government.
Thank you very much, Brenda, for such an interesting journey. let me invite Ms. Kelly and welcome Ms. Kelly to give a talk to us today.
That's me.
Kelly,
It's a pleasure to be here. And I must say, Brenda, that was such a beautiful and rich and heartfelt talk. I'm actually finding it hard to follow you, but congratulations. It's such an extraordinary body of work. And knowing you as I do, it's incredibly heartfelt and important. And in sharing that picture of Ben Ennis-Butler, you've also made me feel very, very old. As Ernesto said, I'm zooming in from Naarm, Melbourne, on the lands of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to start by paying my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And also to thank them for their care of the country on which I live and work, and for their ongoing cultural contribution to this place and to Australia more broadly. And I also extend this respect to all First Nations people joining us here today. What I'm hoping to do today is to speak something, very different take, to speak about the way in which the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the landscape of the visual arts, and the ways in which we work and do what we do, and hopefully open up a space where the insights and reflection it's provided might point to a new and improved way, new and improved ways of working, creating and sharing in the visual arts, a new way of seeing things, as the title suggests. Of course, I'll be speaking from the perspective of my experience, which is that of a collection curator in major public art museums and as a former museum director. But I hope that the perspective translates to you in whatever area of the arts you work or hope to work in into the future. And what I will see now if I can drive the PowerPoint. While I'm speaking, I'd like to share a PowerPoint just by way of background, really. Let's see if this will work. I'm sharing a PowerPoint of installation images of a range of exhibitions I curated in just two of the institutions I've worked in, the National Gallery of Victoria, where I was curator of contemporary art for close to a decade, and most recently the Ian Potter Museum of Art, where I was a designer. It's really only a various projects, and I have to admit their selections be determined by what I had to hand here. I didn't want to trouble colleagues chasing installation images. They're pretty static viewing, and I apologise for that, but I hope it gives you an indication of the scale and variety of my different projects. And as I was putting the PowerPoint together, and if you'll look at the dates of some of these, it really does give an indication of the pace at which these projects came. And I realise now why I always felt so absolutely exhausted. These projects are a combination of exhibitions I conceived and developed on my own, collaborative projects developed by curatoriums, and projects where I was the coordinating curator of another institution's sort of incoming exhibition, where I had to work with that incoming package, make it my own and present it in a new way. And look, of course, no exhibition's the work of one person alone. So, and being the curator you're really only the most public person from a large and essential team. So in sharing these images, I'd like to pay tribute to all of my colleagues across various institutions who've worked with me on them. And most importantly, to every artist involved, because for me, these collaborations have always been the most rewarding part of my working life and really the most enjoyable. Living in Melbourne, I share the dubious honour with my fellow Melburnians of living in the city that's experienced the longest period of lockdown around the globe, 262 days, or nearly 9 months. And thankfully, these weren't consecutive. What we've witnessed during this period within Australia and around the world in terms of the sector's capacity to shift and adapt and quickly, I think is nothing short of remarkable. and it comes with some permanent positive changes as well as a number of challenges. What I'd like to discuss today is what we might learn and retain from this time, which, as we are seeing the emergence of the new Omicron COVID variant, is sadly far from over. Will we allow this time and this experience to change us as a sector for the better, or will we simply return to life as normal, whatever that may be, once it's over? It may be a strange thing to say, but the pandemic was actually a really positive thing for me personally. And I must admit my privilege here. I'm a white middle-class woman living in a country with an excellent healthcare system that has in no way experienced the extraordinary death toll that we've seen in other nations around the world. These, of course, are not insignificant factors, and to a certain extent, they've influenced this perspective. The pandemic gave me the opportunity to slow down, to experience a clearer division between work and life, even though I was working from home, ironically, and to spend more time with my family. I also, I must admit, loved not having to commute. Importantly, it also gave me time to reflect on the way and the pace at which I'd been working, to interrogate my motivations and values, to question how I want to be and contribute to our world. And not surprisingly, I also thought about the many things that are great about the art world, our real sense of community and purpose, our openness to possibilities and difference, and also the things that I wanted to change. I arrived at the end of Melbourne's lockdown in late 2020 in a very different place mentally, and my COVID rethink has seen me move beyond the museum for the first time in my working life, and I must say I'm loving it. It's made me realise that a multitude of big, exciting, really different opportunities can present themselves to you when you are outside of an organisation, something that I've never been in a position to experience before. And that some of the changes I believe our sector needs are also easier to envision and discuss when you're outside of the museum, where you're not sort of constantly by necessity so consumed with getting things done. I think we can all agree that the pivot to online delivery that we saw across the visual arts over the last 2 years, we wouldn't probably have conceived of doing this panel via Zoom 2 years ago, and happily Brenda and I'd be joining you in Kuala Lumpur, is one of the most obvious changes in art museums and galleries. And it's enabled us to reach audiences anywhere and to build recognition for the work that we do well beyond our usual reach. And this is really important from an Australian perspective. We still really do, despite the great work being here, you often hear conversations bemoaning the lack of exposure and recognition, rightly so, of Australian artists internationally. We can often feel still like we're functioning on a periphery. This shift to the digital, the online space is wonderful, obviously. But as many of us have realised during the pandemic, virtual programming, and I'm sure that Ernesto and the team can agree with this today, virtual programming is actually no less work than programming in real life. And now that we've returned to a somewhat hybrid model where institutions are opening their doors to the public while being expected to continue to deliver a really, unique online offering that doesn't simply broadcast what they're doing in the museum, the pressure on already strained institutions is doubled. And look, throughout this talk, when I'm speaking about museums and galleries, I'm perhaps not so much speaking about our largest state institutions here, but more about the vast network of museums and galleries that populate what's referred to in Australia as the small to medium sector, that sort of next tier down. Museums and galleries that created new content during lockdown rather than revisiting their digital archives really differentiated themselves from the pack. But the ongoing pressures of this are immense during this time when those institutions are also in recovery mode. I recently had the pleasure of interviewing some of Australia's museum directors and commercial gallerists for a series of articles that I was writing. And one of the common responses of the museum directors to this new digital landscape was the capacity it provided for experimentation and for giving things a go. All extolled the positives of loosening the expectations of getting things perfect before they were sort of released into the world. And I got the sense that they hoped that this sense of trial and error and a kind of playfulness would continue. There was also discussion about the differentiation between a museum's website and social media, and how social media provided a much needed sense of immediacy and connection during this time. Digital communication, it might be obvious to say, can no longer be one way. We've moved away from, it needs to function as a forum. We've really moved away from the digital being broadcast, and it needs to give audiences the ability to create a dialogue with a museum or gallery. Social media offers institutions the opportunity to convey their personality, for want of a better term, and to be lighter, more personable and more playful. Interestingly, one director actually said, much to my delight, more joyful. I think this is an important and monumental shift away from the didactic and the worthy. However, from a staffing capacity, these digital tools are voracious and hungry beasts that must be constantly fed, and they require time, expertise, a willingness to shift and change strategies and approaches, and a ready stream of quick content. And in saying quick, I certainly mean that in inverted commas, because this content is delivered in the blink of an eye, but it's not necessarily quick to research and write. I was also surprised that Australia's commercial galleries did very well during lockdown, with online sales exceeding expectations. And during the course of my interviews, some of the gallerists reflected that this may well have been due to restricted interstate and international travel and the funds that this freed up. One actually talked about the way that she'd realised that people spent possibly huge amounts on the beauty industry. I assume she was talking about facelifts and the like, but with this money freed up, their sales actually were incredibly strong. But they did note that purchasing online also tended to be limited to the value of the work in question, and that for larger purchases, buyers still generally wanted to see the work before committing. Interestingly, within Australia, many commercial galleries also expanded their own digital offering during the various lockdowns. And I should say that Melbourne Victoria had a very long series of lockdowns, but these have varied from state to state, given the impact of COVID. And we've had extended periods where our state borders have been closed. The Northern Territory, for example, and Western Australia have had a very different experience of the pandemic. They've been very much free to go about their usual business during this time, but not so much for the southeastern states, and particularly Victoria, where I live. So during the pandemic, as I said, many commercial galleries also expanded their digital offering, developing content that included online exhibitions, artist interviews, podcasts, and gallery magazines. But of course, despite the strong commercial sales, the last 2 years have been incredibly tough for artists, and the inequalities that are prevalent in our broader society have also played out across the creative sector. A large majority of artists in Australia were unable to access government support initiatives such as JobKeeper, and many experienced the juggle of maintaining their day job, which of course is often teaching, which had moved online. And we, as Brenda, I'm sure can agree, that the pressure on those working within an academic setting, tertiary setting, was really immense during this time. So they were teaching online, supervising homeschooling, and working in the restricted confines of home while they were prevented from travelling to their studios during various lockdowns. Sadly, the Victorian government, or the Australian government, I should say, was also extraordinarily slow in responding to the needs of the sector, despite clear evidence of the arts' economic contribution and the severity of the impact on the pandemic on a workforce that is by its very nature precarious. As a result, there's been a lot of discussion about the vulnerability of casual workers within the arts and the dire rates of pay. But regrettably, as a nation, we didn't see the pandemic shift the needle on the discussion about the introduction of a universal basic income, which would make such a fundamental difference to so many. And obviously this includes people well beyond the arts sector. For gallerists, looking after the welfare of the artists they represent became a top priority. The stalled momentum of careers has been challenging, along with the heartbreak of cancelled museum and gallery shows, or of having made and installed exhibitions only to have them close with no one seeing them in real life. Yet, despite this, many artists have continued to deliver international commissions and projects overseas, adapting to working remotely because they must, and really have achieved tremendous results. Not surprisingly for artists and art workers alike, issues of mental health and of community care have really come to the fore during the pandemic. And I think this is one of the positives that I hope we can hold on to as we return to our new normal. The pandemic's impact on staff and acknowledgement of the different effects of extended lockdowns on their teams has been a shared concern of all of our museum directors, along with the recognition that this is also an increased personal and broader management responsibility in an already challenging time. Barriers between work and life have dissolved as children and pets have interrupted Zoom meetings, and I'm surprised that hasn't happened to me yet, and that we've been introduced into people's homes as they work from improvised workplaces on kitchen tables, in bedrooms and on balconies. The importance of well-being as a real concern, not an HR, not a line in an HR manual, and of really getting to know your colleagues outside of work and of enabling them to be open and honest about their stresses, struggles, and anxiety has really been one of the great positives of this time. Against the backdrop of the pandemic and lockdowns around the world, several protest movements also ignited, building a global momentum fueled by years of oppression, anger, and frustration. Widespread cultural movements such as Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and the wave of gender protests seen throughout the Trump presidency and beyond, and public actions such as the school strike for climate and those most recently around COP26 in Glasgow have brought issues of race, gender, power and inequity and our collective and sort of devastating impact on the planet into broad consciousness. And perhaps not surprisingly, I think we've also seen these paradigm shifts starting to make their impact felt within the international museum sector, manifesting in long overdue debates around the connection of institutions and their collections to slavery, empire, and colonisation, the representation of gender and cultural diversity in museum staff and within collections and exhibitions, and the ethics of how the money provided by corporate sponsors and philanthropy is generated, Museums are also really now being pressured from both within and outside to change. And it's also been interesting to me that discussions about hierarchical and toxic museum work cultures and bullying and staff burnout have also been really prevalent during this time. To my mind, the way the art sector goes about its work is one of the first things that needs transformation. We're an industry driven by passion, which is so important. And it's a real privilege to, really love and enjoy what you do. But it does also leave you open to exploitation, overwork, and burnout. The visual arts are, like in many places, are chronically underfunded in Australia. And this particularly affects the small to medium sector, which are under-resourced and understaffed, but increasingly expected to do more and more for their communities. The combination of increased expectations and a desire for innovation and excellence comes at the personal cost of management and staff, and our high expectations. And I really do have to put up my hand here, because as a museum director, I know, I have extraordinarily high standards for myself, and I know that I place these on my staff. So these high expectations and the absolute care for and pride in what we do, I think really result in a perfect storm of doing more and more with less. One of the greatest strengths in the art world is our capacity to produce extraordinary results with modest budgets, and to dress things up so they look incredible, despite how little the result may have cost. But this is also perhaps one of our biggest weaknesses, as demonstrating need is all the more difficult when we're papering over the cracks and everything looks so good. This may also be why it's so difficult to attract support for core museum business, and why we often see philanthropic support for shiny and bright new projects succeed, despite the additional work and stress they place on already overburdened organisations. While universally acknowledged, the incredibly poor rates of pay for museum staff, and I should say also our artists, remains unaddressed. And we continue to sign on knowing that we're in a competitive market, and the fact that we sign on because we know that if we don't accept a position, regardless of the terrible pay, that someone else will, and that these opportunities are few and far between. Despite being run by well-intentioned individuals who truly believe in collaboration and care for the sector in its entirety, museums function in a highly competitive market and are often pitted against each other for funding, audiences, and perhaps most importantly, in terms of their profile. State government bodies and local councils alike champion and expect original, innovative programming for their museum, making coming together on projects less rather than more likely. Yet despite this, we're happily beginning to see new models of institutional collaboration within the Australian art world, as well as new leadership models. The pairing up of an artistic and executive director, for example, or two directors sharing a role and each working part-time. And these have really begun to chip away at traditional institutional hierarchies and demonstrate a more distributed sense of decision-making and power. As the current debates around museums have shown, deep and meaningful change will only occur when our institutions commit to and implement structural change. And despite the positive changes I've just mentioned, overall, Australian art museums have been slow in this regard. This is about leadership and power, about sharing it and handing it over, not simply about seeing increased diversity and access reflected in programming and collection development. Diversity needs to be embedded within the museum itself, from its board and CEO through to its curatorial, programming, education and marketing staff. It's only by encouraging differences of experience and perspectives across an institution that we can shift the way in which diversity is still largely addressed in our museums. And that is currently through public-facing exhibitions, events and programs. Really what's going on behind the scenes hasn't changed much at all. The fundamental structural changes I'm advocating for here also align to the powerful international momentum to decolonise our museums, moving this beyond the perspective of collections, collecting and display practices, which of course are monumentally important, to the way in which we effectively think and operate as institutions and the way in which we communicate with our audiences. Key to these major structural changes is governance, who sits at the top of our organisations. And within Australia, governance of the small to medium art museums needs particular attention. A well-meaning but inexperienced or misdirected board can wreak havoc on a small organisation, and there are countless examples nationally of this being the case. We need more interrogation and scrutiny of board members' motivations for joining boards and analysis of the skills they provide, along with more training of boards in terms of their strategic, not operational responsibilities, the why they're there. Far too often boards become seduced and distracted by the bright lights of an institution's programming and public offering, allowing them to sidestep the vital role they play in advocacy and fundraising. And of course, that's just two of their responsibilities. This can leave staff whose role it is to fulfill these aspects of an organisation's mission feeling vulnerable and compromised. As an aside, an interesting article appeared in the Financial Review this week titled "Half of Men in Corporate Australia are Fatigued by Gender Equity." I kid you not. And with the opening paragraph, and I quote, "Half of men working in white-collar professions are tired of the gender equality discussion in the workplace and believe reverse discrimination is occurring, according to a survey commissioned by workplace consultancy, The Dream Collective," end quote. Not surprisingly, the founder and director of The Dream Collective, who undertook the research, Sarah Liu, said the research pointed to a discrepancy between men's perception and reality. She went on to say, and I quote again, "What that really signals is that people don't really have a sound understanding of what privilege is, because for people with privilege, taking away that privilege feels like discrimination," end quote. Without diving too much into this, given that so many chairs of Australia's Visual Arts Board are men and are largely drawn from the corporate sector, we also really need to interrogate what patriarchal views such as these might mean for a sector largely fueled, at the working end by women, and also for our female museum leaders. Are we working with the right captains of industry? Of course, this is all easy to say, but as I know, far less easy to implement. Museums demonstrate their agility in their programming, but remain overall structurally rigid, bureaucratic beasts. While the types of initiatives that we've witnessed recently in the US are welcome, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, for example, have recently employed a senior director of belonging and inclusion. The Met, for example, has employed a chief diversity officer, and these are slowly being echoed in Australia. For example, we've just seen the Art Go of New South Wales appoint a diversity and inclusion manner, and the National Gallery of Australia is currently developing a gender equity plan. And we're also seeing, finally, a long overdue increase in the number of senior positions for Indigenous leaders within our museums. But we also need to remember that being the only staff member charged with this responsibility and being expected to act like an organisational conscience can be isolating and exhausting. Systemic change will only occur through an interrogation of organisational cultures and long-held assumptions about knowledge and expertise, and a willingness to let go of the way things have always been. And this takes money. Employing staff on short-term contract positions may be a band-aid solution, but again, potentially leaves those who are not part of the status quo vulnerable, without the benefits and security afforded to full-time permanent staff. And simply replacing long existing, often more senior staff with a new woke team is another form of short-termism. While expedient, these types of solutions often mask other kinds of bias or discrimination, say ageism, for example, and can lead to a major loss of collection-based and organisational expertise. Bringing the old way of doing things together with the demands and expectations of the new is no doubt harder, but the cultural and creative abrasion that results will lead to unexpected outcomes and long-term change. And before I finish up today, I hope I can quickly add one more thing on my list of post-pandemic changes that I hope we can hold on to, and that is, ironically, less travel. I love as much as anyone to jump on a plane and go to an opening interstate or to attend the vernissage of the Venice Biennale. But I think, as we see here on Zoom today, it's not always necessary. And we need to be much more conscious of this and the impact of the enormous number of air miles the international art world creates. I'm also heartened by the increasing consciousness of the environmental impact and huge waste of exhibition design builds, and you can see them in some of the images I've shared on the screen today, and hope that we can greatly change the way in which these are conceived in coming years through the introduction of greener materials and far more recycling and reuse. But that's another conversation entirely. I would love to see the death of MDF within museums. I hope my discussion today hasn't come across as a litany against the art world and museums and galleries, as this is certainly not my intention. I love the visual arts. It's the community that's nurtured me spiritually and creatively for more than 2 decades and will, I hope, continue to do so. However, within our art institutions, regardless of scale, the busyness of our working lives and the challenge of balancing the ambition of our vision with the time and resources available leaves us with little time to reflect, let alone consciously and strategically make big changes. I hope by continuing to have conversations such as these and by letting our institutions know what we expect of them, that we can build some momentum. I believe one of the most exciting things to happen for the arts during COVID is the shake-up of museums. For if museum structures and the composition of their leadership and staff change, what they look at, show, and effectively endorse will also change. Bringing different perspectives to bear on contemporary museology will not only change the way we tell stories, but who gets to speak. And this is not only exciting, but fundamentally important. And that's an art world that I want to be part of and continue to champion. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen because you have seen these slides too many times.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kelly, for such an interesting explanation on your practice. I was wondering, I would like to start with the questions, and I would like to pick on you first, just to carry on with your team. What is the profit making of the museum? You as an art director, you have a beautiful building, such a wonderful infrastructure, personnel, exhibitions to put up, and then what is the gain after that? Is there any profit making? Because I guess you work with a fund which is being allocated by the government, or a sponsorship, or different companies which might chip in some money to do an exhibition. So is there any profit making out of any exhibition that you have participated on?
It's a very good question, and interesting. I think if I reflect on my recent position at the Ian Potter Museum, because of course that was in a university context, which is in itself quite unique. At the Potter, we had made a conscious decision, and it certainly hadn't been the case in the past, that we weren't going to charge for exhibitions, to entry to exhibitions. So that immediately changes your ability to raise money. You don't have ticket sales. Yes. But also, interestingly, within that context, the university had an expectation that as part of their system, we couldn't lose money, and we actually had to we did have to make a profit. So we weren't even just allowed to break even. There was no year where I could just put in a balance sheet that said 0 at the end of the financial year, as much as I would have loved to. Yes. So the challenge of that, I suppose, is that you were constantly juggling as I've said, your ambition with the reality of the money that you had to hand, and also trying to project so that you would land with that profit. And we were fortunate, we could keep it very modest, but if we didn't achieve that, there would be repercussions. So you were kind of penalized either way, in that your annual budget was always tight and you had to run it very lean, make the money elsewhere. And if you did, if something went awry, and for example, you did lose money on a major exhibition that impacted your year overall, the university would then potentially look at your funding for the next year and reduce it. So it was a very careful juggling act. I think the thing that makes it very hard for any institution, and means that they have to raise money on top of their annual budget for their programs, is that their staffing costs are often 60, 70, if not, closer to 80% of their annual budget. And that's a lot of money. But as I've said, that's a lot of money where people aren't being paid enough. So it's a challenging situation.
Yeah, I believe so, because as I mentioned, the infrastructure, personnel, water, electricity, aircon, and maintenance.
Yes, and I also think that, one of the challenging things within Australia, and this is where the East and West Coast probably function a little differently. I think you would be quite unlikely to see an institution take sponsorship from a mining company on the East Coast, for example, but in the West, it's not a problem. So as you start to look at, if institutions are really starting to look at who is willing to support their programs as sponsors and interrogate what companies do, your pool of potential funders becomes a lot, and we've just lost poor Ernesto, becomes a lot smaller. So it's a constant line about your ethics.
I'd also say, Kelly, with your comment, just to pick up on your comment about mining companies in WA, in lots of cases, art centres, for example, Aboriginal art centres in Western Australia don't have an option, because the majority of their funding comes from mining companies.
Yes. And
part of that is also those mining companies, which for me personally do so much damage. That's part of their social responsibility, is to put some of their vast profits, like a minuscule amount of their vast profits, back into those art centres. And look, when I worked at the National Gallery of Australia, every major show was sponsored by mining, and the same case now, I think, and I won't mention the companies, and I had good relationships with people who worked at high levels with those companies, who wanted to do the right thing.
Yes, absolutely, I agree.
When you lose that, as we've seen in the case with the Juukan Gorge with Rio Tinto and the destruction of 46,000-year-old really important cultural sites for community. When corporate memory leaves a place and corporate responsibility leaves a place and is just replaced with, you know, the profit margin constantly, culture gets chucked. You know, culture becomes it becomes collateral damage in that case, and it's an ongoing, you know, push me pull you, because the arts sector, as we know in Australia, doesn't have high level federal government support. It is seen as certainly the bastard child, and you know, in every which way, unless you're involved in the military, you know, the military representation of historical events, then you do get funded. But you know, it's a really, and working in the tertiary sector as well, these are the two biggest sectors in this country that have been absolutely smashed,
decimated,
during the pandemic, and the, you know, not just the tertiary sector, specifically the humanities, arts, social sciences. So we're at a real crossroads, and I don't say that in, you know, for want of throwing up cliches. In some ways, I think it pushes people to make some good decisions. You know, like you said, I've been very happy working at home. My back hasn't, but I like working at home and not going into the office constantly, and working out what your priorities are with your family and what's important, you know, because everything that we knew has just changed vastly in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's so true. And it won't, you know, I think the challenge is it's not going to get easier for a while. I think in Melbourne, we've seen, because people have been locked down for so long, and there's a level of exhaustion and I would say for many, understandably, desperation for life to return to normal. There's a lot of, yes, absolutely, and heartbreak, you know, and you know, it has had a huge impact on so many people. There is this sense that you just want to get back to doing things the way you did before, but in some ways things will never be the same. And I think we're in a period where we should, you know, try to collectively acknowledge that and look at what positives might come out of that. I don't know if that's just too optimistic, but I've somewhat been defeated by watching the rampant consumerism of Black Friday sales and thinking, just what is wrong with the world? But
particularly when you know where Black Friday came from.
I don't know where Black Friday came from.
Now, I've heard different things from this. I'm trying to, because we keep losing poor Ernesto.
We'll keep chatting, Ernesto, don't worry.
Ernesto, are you on? I think he's frozen. So he's asked me to
Terrific.
Just continue with some questions that our audience has sent us. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to continue with that.
No, please, Shalini.
Brenda, sorry?
No, he just said, please go ahead.
Okay. Brenda, the PhD researcher you covered, the 1934 PhD researcher, how much of an influencer was he through his research? So was he referenced significantly? I know he's not he's not the only researcher for this area, but how much of an impact did that unhappy research have?
I don't know. I don't know how much, because to be honest, I'm delving still further into that. I've sourced, he produced a number of publications. He produced his thesis. I've acquired a copy of that from the Adelaide University at vast expense. He produced a publication under medical, through medical channels in 1936 or 1935, 1936, that came out. Who knows what influence that had at the time. He also produced a series of not self-published, they were published through Cambridge, but I have seen a copy of 3 volumes they are in the South Australian Museum archives, and they read like a boy's own adventure. You know, it's another letter from the north, and there's lots of there's some really horrific photographs in that. There's one of him, a self-portrait of him digging up the grave of a recently deceased Aboriginal woman because he had been coveting her skeleton, and he knew her before she died. She had serious bone deformities, and because this was the trade that took place, you know, and certainly not just in Australia, this is across the world. People from marginalised communities, their bodies were valuable commodities. And I don't know how much influence he actually had. I've done quite a lot of research into when he received his doctorate, and he would have received it at Elder Hall. I've written about this in my thesis, at Elder Hall at the University of Adelaide in 1936, and I write about another artist in my thesis, Destiny Deacon, who Kelly will know very well, wonderful First Nations artist who I've never forgotten a performative lecture she gave in 1994 at the Adelaide Visual Artists Suite in that very hall. And I feel, you know, you look at the ghosts that operate in those kind of colonial structures. So he's a ghost for me. He's not a name that comes up as much as someone like Norman Tyndale. Tyndale is far more resonant across certainly anthropology relating to First Nations peoples in Australia. But, you know, Hackett, I think probably would have had quite a bit of influence at the time. Adelaide was a seat of great power in Australia. It loves the fact that it was a non-convict state. It sort of considers itself a little bit above the states from the east that had much higher convict populations. Adelaide, there was a lot of influence of people from South Australia. The Northern Territory was the Northern Territory of South Australia. And so it was considered as part of the remit of South Australia. A lot of research into First Nations peoples went up into the territory, and people from South Australia have certainly played a big role in that. But I have to do a little bit, and I'm still doing research on that because I want to see if I can find, we can't find the original negatives. All that I found were the little proof sheets that he took of my grandmother, and they are pasted into his field notes. I'd like to know if there are negatives somewhere, and did he possibly take other horrific photographs of my grandmother, but I don't know if he had much more influence across the broader medical field at the time.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you. Sorry, my internet just dropped twice. I have a question, and it's for both of you, but this question divided into contemporary art and First Nation art. So my question goes in this way. How to educate the new generation about the contribution of Australian art to the world, from the contemporary point of view and from the First Nation arts to the world, because from this side of the sea, we see First Nation art as aboriginal art. So not many people understand that term, and it came across to me when we had the discussion the other day. So that is why I did a little bit of research. So how to educate this new generation of young people of the direction that Australian art is taking from the First Nation art and the contemporary artists? Please, anyone?
Well, do you mind if I jump in there?
Oh,
Yes,
yeah,
please.
please.
First Nations art is contemporary art.
Is contemporary art. That's exactly what I was going to say.
Oh, okay.
Yes, it's made now. It's created now. So I, you know, just as my background is multidisciplinary, it's also across all of those platforms, and it's not one or the other. And so I don't call, you know, and this is a long-standing discussion too, Ernesto. It's been one that gets bandied around, and I can think of, you know, when, say for example, a gallerist from Melbourne, Gabrielle Pizzi, the late Gabrielle Pizzi, at the Cologne Art Fair a few decades ago, she was denied entry because she was showing what she considered contemporary First Nations art. from Australia, but it was dismissed by the organisers as being folk art. You know, one of the different terminologies that folk art, primitive art, art and craft, you know, not in the realm of fine
Sort of the
art.
discrimination
Yes.
is kind of.
But, you know, I think Australia's been, it's just a given, isn't it, Kelly? I mean,
absolutely.
if you're having a major contemporary exhibition in Australia, you have First Nations artists in it, regardless of where they come from as well. And so this idea of traditional practice as well is completely, that is rubbery. I mean, you look at some amazing work coming out of, say, for example, Gellatly from up in northeast Arnhem Land. Some phenomenal work has been created through the Art Centre, Buku Larange Mulka Art Centre there, that's just absolutely at the cutting edge and led by young artists who are really incorporating ancient symbology into this, any kind of media that they can get, whether it's film, immersive media, working with, you know, here we are recycling, Kel, you know, the idea of using steel cast-offs, rubber, you know, working with the materials that you've got. You'll have artists who are working in urban environments who are utilising traditional pigments. But, you know, what I make as a First Nations person is First Nations art. It's also contemporary art.
Yes.
And I think it's dealt with a lot better perhaps here in Australia, just because people like myself have pushed it and pushed back on the understanding of it for at least two to 3 decades now. And, you know, it's a discussion where it's like, we expect people to keep up with us, you know. I pray for the day that I don't have a student in my course say to me, why didn't I get taught this at school? I mean, I think that's a failing of the education system here in Australia, but there's no excuse because there is so much information out there. And it is up to all of us to educate ourselves as well. I mean, you know, my understanding of what happens across Malaysia is lacking. You know, if I was coming over to Kuala Lumpur, I'd be doing a lot of background research as well, and trying to keep on top of what is happening in other countries too. So, and I certainly don't know everything that's happening here in Australia. I sometimes feel like I have to run fast to keep up with who's coming out with the work that they're doing now. But that's our responsibility, you know, not to be complacent. But anyway, it's contemporary and First Nations. First Nations work produced by First Nations artists in Australia today is contemporary.
And Esther, I was going to say probably a very simple explanation of that is in the images I shared, there was the installation of a major retrospective by Gordon Bennett that I did at the National Gallery of Victoria in 2007, I think. I curated that, and this is where, as Brenda says, the expectations of artists are pushing institutions, and over time this has changed the way that this is, you know, Indigenous art is absolutely conceived as contemporary practice. And as a curator of contemporary art, I worked with Indigenous artists just as a matter of course. But for someone like Gordon Bennett, that was a very particular instance where his stand changed the organisation, because there had been a retrospective of his work slated for a number of years at the gallery well before I arrived, and it had been proposed at that time by the Senior Curator of Indigenous Art, Judith Ryan. There'd been initial discussions, and then when it came close to the exhibition being realised and the research undertaken, Gordon said, you know, I have a long-standing position of not wanting to be identified as an Indigenous artist. I'm a contemporary artist who happens to be an Indigenous person.
Yeah.
And so the result of that, and all power to him and to my great benefit and privilege, that exhibition moved from the Indigenous art department to contemporary art, and I became the curator. That in itself, you know, institutionally wasn't such a big deal, was something that could be very easily accommodated. But what it also meant was that, and this has happened around Australia, works historically by him that had been acquired through Indigenous art departments needed to be recategorised. So what he effectively did was dismantle systems of classification that are central to museum structures, because it means that accession numbers need to be done, records need to be changed, where even sometimes where those works are housed needed to be in different spaces. So, you know, there are institutional histories of this as well, but thankfully we're in the space now where Indigenous art is contemporary art.
Very interesting, because I believe that a lot of people have this stereotype idea of indigenous arts or contemporary art, and they think that just because of is striking an installation and a person who has spent a number of hours producing an artwork manually, also sometimes the new generation don't understand that, and they believe that this is all art. And it's good that you have highlighted that.
No, he's frozen again.
Aboriginal art, or first produced now. No, it's produced now, and it's important. I have a question, and I think it goes to Brenda. Does the color of your presentation,
The background
on your slide presentation, the orange, does it has any connotation? It has been chosen especially?
I just hate white.
No, I was wondering, because if I related orange or red color, it will be like earth color, you know.
It would be like a what color? Sorry, you dropped out.
Or orange, or like earth color.
Oh, sorry.
You know, the ground.
No, I love orange. I also like I guess I like confusing people as well, because I always know this. When I was a curator at the National Gallery, and also a curator at the Art Gallery of Western Australia, oh my God, the background walls were always brown for anything to do with Aboriginal art. And when you go to the Art Gallery of when I went to the Art Gallery of New South Wales as a young student a long time ago, you'd go through the colonial galleries, you'd come to the two 19th century plaster busts of Truganini and Wurredi, two Tasmanian Aboriginal people who were promoted as the last of the Tasmanian, which is a fallacy. You'd go down the stairs into the basement where Aboriginal and Melanesian art was jammed together, and everything was brown. They were on brown Hessian, you know, so I have a hatred of brown for that reason. But also, to be a bit more serious, it's also about standing out, you know, so the color is there to stand out. It is to kind of like, you know, challenge you. And I love playing around with color when I'm displaying First Nations art. When I did the National Indigenous Art Triennial in 2007 at the National Gallery, the first room we walked into, the big guns room as we called it, was some amazing senior artists from communities in the Northern Territory, and the walls were kind of a royal blue, because it just made the natural ochres and pigments that they used just popped. Yes. So, you know, that's an aesthetic thing as well. You're challenging the idea of this lovely staid, and you know, it's a similar thing for me with catalogue design. It's just got to get people out of the mindset that this is how it's always looked, and this is how it's going to continue to look. And to be a little bit more serious, the white space, my dear colleague Hetty Perkins calls the margins a white space for Black people. So I tend not to use, or people of colour. I tend not to use a lot of white. It just looks a bit cold to me.
Yeah, understood. I think we are just about to finish, and then I would like to encourage a lot of people asking questions. But time is our worst enemy at this point of time, and then I would like to invite first, thank you, and thank for the time and the appreciation and the passion that you have put in your presentation, because you really talk from the heart. I can feel in showing the pictures and talking about your history, your personal journey, you know, how much effort you put in installation and in present the work is very important. And before I finish, I would like to also thank Kenny and the team for being behind. And my humble apologies because my internet has dropped, and invite Datin Shalini to give a few words before we finish. Thanks.
Thank you,
everyone.
Ernesto. Thank you for such an excellent moderated session. And to Kelly and Brenda for sharing so generously your knowledge and insights insofar as informing us really to what is currently so topical. You know, the talks give reason to pause that whenever we research, whenever we exhibit, whenever we comment, we really need to do so very respectfully and responsibly. That we need to continue doing so through challenging times that may limit us physically and take the opportunity to operate virtually. And that there is so much value in reflecting. Constantly reflecting and reevaluating. And I see, you know, just as background, Kelly and I have known each other professionally, gosh, for over a decade. I would say 15 years now. And Brenda and I met professionally through her research, through an article that she had written about 15 years ago, or 10 years ago, would it be?
Probably 24 years ago.
Oh my goodness.
Oh.
Right. Okay. Well, there you go.
We better don't say numbers.
Which you know, as a youngster, she wrote, and which I came across in my capacity as a visiting academic at Oxford. And when I read it, I thought, I really need to meet this woman. And the rest is history. And her first comment was, oh God, that article, I had completely forgotten about it. But you see, what we do really has an afterlife. And that's why being mindful and being responsible. And Kelly's voice has really changed in the last year, because she was probably the most diplomatic person I have ever met. And I'm just delighted that you speak with such sincerity and gravitas and information on how we can improve our cultural landscape going forward. So I thank you very much, all three of you, for generously contributing your time and knowledge to GWKL. We look forward to keeping in touch and celebrating all your achievements, you know, past and what is expected in future. Congratulations and thanks so much. And thanks to our audience for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in this afternoon's session, which again will feature very interesting luminaries. And thank you all again, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Brenda. Nice meeting you. See you again.
You too, Ernesto. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.